HMS Minotaur. One of the backbone of the Royal Navy's 74-gun ships, Minotaur would take part in some of the era's most well-known sea battles. She would serve in Nelson's fleet, taking part in and protecting his flank in two of his most iconic engagements. This is a brief history of HMS Minotaur and some of the men who served her, including the tragic story of her loss in the North Sea on December 22, 1810. A third-rate ship of the line, she was built in the Woolwich Dockyard. Her keel laid down in 1788, she was commissioned and launched in 1793, the hull being 172 feet in length, carrying 28 32-pounders on her lower decks and 28 24-pounders on her upper decks, plus bow and stern guns, for a total armament of 74 guns. She carried a complement of 550 officer seamen and marines. Minotaur was one of the Levanthian/Colossus class of 74s, built to the design of the captured French ship the Courageux, which, captured in 1761, provided the British with a much more weatherly design of 74. The battle honors and unfortunate fate of the Courageux happened to be captured in another of this channel's videos. Please watch that if you're interested to find out more. Early years. Launched in 1793, it was early in 1794 that the command of Minotaur would fall to Captain Thomas Louis, who would command the ship for the next 8 years until 1802. Thomas Louis was born in 1758 and said to be one of the illegitimate grandsons to King Louis XIV. Having been in the Navy since he was 11 years old, he'd seen action around most of the world, serving as a lieutenant in both the Battle of Ushant and the First Battle of Cape St. Vincent. It was during the latter that Admiral Rodney appointed him commander of the badly damaged Spanish flagship Phoenix. He would then work tirelessly to get the battered ship to Gibraltar and then back to England, where sadly the Admiralty decided not to confirm his appointment as commander. However, his promotion came not long after this, and by 1794 he'd been a captain for 10 years when he took command of HMS Minotaur. In 1797, while serving under the Channel Fleet, Minotaur would become embroiled in the infamous Spithead Mutiny, when 16 ships were taken by their crews and refused to put to sea unless to defend England's honor. They stood in protest of pay rates, treatment, and other standing practices that hadn't been updated in close to 100 years. The mutiny was a relatively peaceful affair, lasting close to a month before Lord Howe himself intervened and went out to their ship to meet with the delegates, where after listening to their appeals, he increased their pay, abolished antiquated practices, and granted pardons from recriminations, giving the mutineers a cheeky pinch on the ear, settling the matter, and returning the fleet to normalcy. Speaking to the trust still held with Captain Louis and his crew, Minotaur was then sent independently from the Channel to reinforce the Mediterranean fleet before being detached with another squadron to reinforce Rear Admiral Nelson, where, upon joining Nelson on August 1, 1798, Minotaur took part in the Battle of the Nile, where the British fleet under Rear Admiral Nelson caught the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay. The French fleet of 13 ships of the line under Admiral de Bruys had anchored their ships bow to stern across the face of the bay, creating a strong seaward-facing position, thinking the British would have no option but to attack them on the seaward-facing side. Given the British fleet was also arriving late in the day, Bruys expected the British to wait until the following morning before launching their attack. Instead, Nelson would raise the flag for his ships to engage those of the enemy. His 14 ships making for the front of the French line, the lead ships acting under their own initiative, found and exploited the deep water channel ahead of the French line to sail in on the landward side and catch the French ships further unprepared. Nelson's flagship, the Vanguard, was sixth into the battle, becoming the first to sail down the seaward side of the column, and after exchanging broadsides with several ships, became engaged with the Spariot. HMS Minotaur, seventh in the line, following directly behind Vanguard, chose not to stop against the already engaged French ships, but passed the Vanguard on the outside and engaged the next French ship of the line, the Aquilon, of 74 guns, thus protecting his admiral's bows. The Aquilon, after suffering the combined fire of both Minotaur and the Theseus, who came up on the landward side, soon struck her colors. The rest of the French received a systematic pounding by the British, the climax of which happened at 10:30 p.m. when the mighty 118-gun L'Orient, the French flagship with an already dead Admiral Bruys on board, caught fire and exploded. A sight so horrific that the fighting ceased for some time afterwards, the crew stunned by what they had witnessed. The next morning, the battle over, 9 French ships of the line had been taken. Nelson brought Captain Louis to the flagship to personally thank him for him and his ship's good service, crediting the Minotaur for playing a crucial role in the turning of the battle. In 1800, serving as Vice Admiral Lord Keith's flagship, she was sent to assist the Austrians in the siege of Genoa. Minotaur, acting as flagship to a flotilla of smaller warships, was tasked with keeping the port closed to any relief forces. The boats of the flotilla patrolled the harbor mouth for the 41 nights the siege lasted, the men taking any opportunity to attack the dockyard and fort with a mixture of bomb vessels and other cannon. There is a note of reference that the Minotaur barely escaped capture at the siege of Genoa, having to be warped out of harbor by the ship's boats. If anyone has any more context or a source for that story, please share in the comments below. I would love to read more of those details. In 1801, HMS Minotaur would be back in Aboukir Bay, this time her cannons and ship's boats used to support the landings of the British Army under Sir Ralph Abercrombie. The French attempted to deny the British the foothold, contesting the beach with much ferocity, until Major General John Moore, of future Spanish fame, would order his men to fix bayonets and advance. Leading from the head of the 40th and 23rd Regiments, the British troops stormed up the sloping sand beaches under the direct fire of the French soldiers until they reached the defensive positions, where the French were soon dispatched to confusion on the tips of the British bayonets. The French cavalry rallied and attacked before they too were dispatched. After peace was signed in 1802, HMS Minotaur returned to England and was paid off for a well-earned refit at the Sheerness dockyard in Kent. Captain Thomas Louis would go on to become Rear Admiral Sir Thomas Louis, 1st Baronet of Cadwell House. He would serve as a competent flag officer again in the eastern Mediterranean before 1807 when he died suddenly aboard his flagship off the coast of Egypt. He would be buried on Manole Island off Malta near the grave of his friend Sir Ralph Abercrombie. For the next 4 years, from 1803 to 1807, HMS Minotaur was under the command of Captain John Mansfield. Born in 1760, John Mansfield was the son of a dockyard worker in Plymouth. One of 7 boys, perhaps indicative of the times, the first 2 would become shipbuilders with their father, and the other 5 would enter the Royal Navy. John was luckier than his other 4 brothers, being the only one to reach the rank of captain and the only one to live beyond his 30s. He became a lieutenant in 1778 and a full captain in 1794. He would go on to command 3 frigates, the first of which was the small frigate Sphinx of 20 guns. The second was the Andromache of 32 guns, which Mansfield is credited with having sailed through the eye of a hurricane on his way to Halifax Harbor. And thirdly, the Dryad of 36 guns, Mansfield commanded as part of the Channel Fleet under Lord Gartner, whose son went to sea for the first time in the Dryad. In 1803, Mansfield would be appointed to take command of Minotaur, where on her first cruise from the Channel, the ship would take so many prizes, including a 40-gun French frigate with a general on board, that she was forced back to harbor for want of crew. Shortly after which, Minotaur was dispatched to join Vice Admiral Nelson once more, and in October 1805 took part in the Battle of Trafalgar. When the English fleet of 32 ships under Vice Admiral Nelson caught the Franco-Spanish fleet of 38 warships off Cape Trafalgar, Nelson enacted his plan. The British formed into 2 columns of attack. Each was to be led by 3 three-deckers. The columns were designed to punch through the enemy line in 2 places, forcing a melee action where the British sailing and gun superiority could be most felt. Minotaur was in Nelson's weather column, but despite her recent refit, was a slow sailor and began to fall back in the light breezes of the morning. As the fleets drew together and entered combat, Minotaur was second from the rear, sailing with the Spariot of 74 guns, the former French prize of the Nile. After Nelson cut the line behind the French admiral's flagship about 1/3 of the way down the combined fleet, the 8 ships under Rear Admiral Dumanoir, forming the van, kept going and made their long turnabout to re-engage, whereupon heading back into the heat of the fighting, they were joined by 2 other ships. These 10 fresh ships posed a serious threat to the now engaged English fleet. The fresh force divided into 2, with 5 ships endeavoring to sail straight in and engage HMS Victory. However, Minotaur and Spartiate had also finally entered the battle and were not going to let their admiral be set upon. Itching for a fight, they cut off and engaged the 5 incoming ships. An artillery duel took place between the 2 English and 4 French ships, exchanging broadsides until the French ships had had their fill of fighting and made sail. The Minotaur and Spartiate were able to get alongside the final Spanish ship, the Neptuno, of 80 guns, who, after being engaged on both sides, hauled down her flag to Minotaur. After Trafalgar, the Neptuno's ensign and Minotaur's Union Jack were presented to Selling Church in Kent by Stephen Hilton, a master's mate in the Minotaur, where they remained until 2015 before passing on to the National Maritime Museum. Although Nelson's loss of life was a blow to the British spirit, he had fulfilled his goal of creating a great victory for the Royal Navy, with an era-defining 17 ships of the line being originally captured, ending any hopes of Napoleon and the French crossing the Channel and invading England. For the next 2 years, Minotaur sailed in the Mediterranean as a flagship to various admirals. Her status as one of the heroes of Trafalgar likely helped her selection as flagship to Rear Admiral Purvis, whose role working with the Portuguese meant that Minotaur was stationed in Lisbon for several months before returning to England for a light repair. HMS Minotaur's next big action was in 1807, when Mansfield, now carrying the flag of Rear Admiral Essington, took part in the Second Battle of Copenhagen. In 1807, Denmark was on the brink of being overrun by France. Britain made the somewhat controversial decision to take their former allies' fleet by force so it could not be seized and used against them. They did so by besieging Copenhagen again, this time taking a more conservative approach than they did with Nelson 6 years earlier. The fleet selectively bombing the fort and docks, while the army under Lord Cathcart besieged the city and unleashed several hundred rockets, which started a number of fires, caused much chaos, and after several nights compelled the Danes to surrender. It was a major strategic victory for the English, taking 18 ships of the line home amongst many other smaller warships. Captain Mansfield left the Minotaur in 1807 after Copenhagen, retiring from the service due to ill health. He would go on to die in 1813 and be buried in St. Margaret's Church in Kent. In 1809, Captain John Barrett would take command of the Minotaur. An Irishman from Drogheda, John Barrett was first made a lieutenant in 1793, becoming a captain in 1795. Before the Minotaur, he had commanded another Trafalgar veteran, the Africa, of 64 guns, sailing her in the North Sea and providing protection to the English merchant convoys. He was an experienced sailor with particular experience in the North Sea and Baltic. In late 1810, having seen a convoy of 60 merchantmen safely through the Belt into the relatively open waters of Gothenburg, most of the shipping now traveled loosely together, making sail for England. HMS Minotaur, returning to Kent, was in company with HMS Loire of 38 guns. The weather was rough immediately upon entering the North Sea, dispersing most of the ships, their captains making their own decisions on how best to sail in the weather. Captain Schomberg of HMS Loire ignored the advice of his pilot and master, changing course to proceed further out into the North Sea, parting company with HMS Minotaur. On the night of December 22nd, the weather was poor. Second Lieutenant Robert Snell had the watch. The ship was sailing under reefed topsails. Captain Barrett had ordered the soundings take place every hour to assist the pilots with their navigation. At midnight, the pilot decided it was time to put the ship about on the other tack. The crew was roused accordingly. Lieutenant Snell was in the process of informing Captain Barrett when the hull hit heavily against the ground. Orders were given immediately to put the ship about, but the efforts were fruitless. The Minotaur had grounded hard into the sands, the tiller had been ripped away, the ships rising and striking down in the sands causing major damage to the hull. Minotaur had already let the sea into her holds, the ship starting to sink. The carpenter reported 15 feet of water and gaining. The resounding question by the officers and crew was, where were they? The roar of surf could be heard over the storm, indicating shore somewhere, but nothing could be seen in the darkness of the night. Neither of the pilots were certain. The one on watch thought they must be on a shoal off the English coast, while the other thought it was more likely the Norderhags sandbank, which turned out to be correct. The Norderhags is a 5-kilometer square, semi-submerged sandbank south of Texel Island on the Dutch coast. The tides and currents of the region exasperating its already natural danger to seafarers. Over the years it has claimed many ships, earning the nickname of the Rizé Bull, or Raging Sandbank. 15 minutes later, the motion of the hull eased. The carpenter reported the waters had risen to the orlop deck. The hull was now too waterlogged to ride the waves, settling instead into the sands, the waves of the storm breaking over top of her. HMS Minotaur, veteran of the Nile and Trafalgar, was now a complete wreck. The crew did what they could. Masts were cut away to lighten the ship. Guns were fired to signal distress to the shore. Nothing could be done in the darkness of the night. The crew was forced to ride out the hull as the situation became increasingly worse. At daybreak, recognition of their location and the perils of their situation were confirmed. The ship was now half sunk by the bows in the sand, rough seas all around them, the distant shore a slim prospect. Of the boats, 3 survived the night, 2 yawls and the ship's launch. At 8 a.m., the Minotaur's back broke. The ship began to part amidships, the seas washing in and through her lower decks. The gunner, Mr. Bones, proposed to take a boat to the shore, which, although thought impossible in the current seas, with the knowledge the hull would not last much longer, Captain Barrett permitted Mr. Bones and 31 volunteers to take the first yawl and make for the shore. The boat broke free of the wreck and after 2 hours successfully found its way to the distant shore. Their success cheered the crew still stranded on the Minotaur, who immediately made for the launch, the crew rushing to board the next available boat. So much so that Lieutenant Snell was not able to make it to the boat. Determined that this was his key to survival, he climbed up the ship's foremast stump and dropped into the water on the path he knew the boat would have to take to break free from the hull, where he was then picked up from the water. The launch with 70-odd seamen and Lieutenant Snell made it safely to shore about an hour later. After seeing the boat safely ashore, the next question from the surviving crew of the Minotaur was, where were the Dutch? In fact, the Dutch had heard the distress cannons during the night, reported the likely cause, and the marine captain of the Texel had sent a pilot ship into the storm to reconnoiter the ship in distress. They found the HMS Minotaur at dawn, however decided the seas were too rough for them to approach closely, much less send boats to the wreck. Captain Barrett and the remaining several hundred survivors clutched on the remains of the wreck, holding out for salvation, their situation worsening as the wreck broke up around them. By mid-morning, the bow half had come free from the stern of the ship, the remains disappearing beneath the surf. At this time, Barrett and another 100 crew took the second and final yawl, appearing to break free from the hull, but soon swamped in the waves. All 100 men, including Captain Barrett, were drowned. Early afternoon, the stern of the ship was seen to roll, turning upright and then breaking up in the seas, the remaining survivors aboard her perishing in the sea. Captain Barrett and 400 sailors, officers, and marines were lost with the HMS Minotaur on the morning of December 3rd, 1810. As with most tragedy, there are smaller, unique stories of human loss that can disappear to the pages of history. From the loss of the Minotaur comes a report of one of these more unique personal stories. Accounts tell of Lieutenant Salsford, who had adopted a wolf cub at Aspero, the wolf growing up within the ship's wardroom, becoming their unofficial mascot, being quite docile and well tempered. It is said that through the chaos of the wreck, Lieutenant Salsford and the wolf stayed in close company with one another. As the wreck broke up, both took to a piece of wreckage that they maintained for a long while in the freezing water. When close to shore, the pair, equally fatigued by the cold, were seen to turn to one another, Salsford and the wolf placing their paws and arms around each other's necks in a final embrace. They sank beneath the waves and were lost. The survivors. Of the 110 crew that survived the Minotaur and made it ashore, Second Lieutenant Snell was the only commissioned officer. That said, all 8 of the midshipmen had been sent with the boats and were saved, along with the ship's surgeon. Later that day, 4 more frozen seamen would be washed ashore, clutching a piece of wreckage, bringing the total amount of survivors to 114. They'd be taken from the beach and immediately made prisoners of war by the Dutch troops, marched to Valenciennes to remain prisoners for 3.5 years before the end of the war and their eventual return to England. Except for one man, once again our enterprising gunner Mr. Bones, who after being imprisoned for the first month made his escape. Traveling by night and hiding in barns and stables by day for 2 weeks, he made it to the shores near Ostend and was able to bribe a smuggler to take him across the channel to England. Upon returning to England, the surviving crew members were held to account with a court-martial for the loss of the Minotaur. Going on to be acquitted, the blame fell instead to the gross navigational errors committed by the pilots. As by the evidence, the pilots seemed to believe the ship was off the Smith's Knoll, when in fact they were 150 kilometers east off the Dutch coast. While in captivity, Lieutenant Snell wrote many angry letters citing the lack of activity on the part of the Dutch to relieve HMS Minotaur and save the crew of the wreck. Indeed, many contemporary reports in England felt the Dutch could have saved some, if not all, of the crew. In their defense, the Dutch, never having been known to shirk dangerous seas, did send a boat out to reconnoiter the wreck but judged it beyond saving. Given 1 in 3 of the boats were swamped, perhaps their stance has more merit than the British public wanted to acknowledge at the time. Conclusion. The HMS Minotaur of 74 guns, one of the backbone of the Royal Navy fleet, served by 2 determined captains, she would go on to earn her laurels in 2 of Lord Nelson's most famous campaigns, protecting his flank on both occasions. After 17 years' hard service in 1810, she was ignominiously wrecked on Norderhaag sandbank, the proud ship and most of her crew meeting their end. Captain John Barrett, 6 officers, 60 marines, 350 sailors, perishing with the ship. In honor of the men who served aboard HMS Minotaur and those who gave their lives to the waves perishing with the ship on December 23rd, 1810, take it away, lads.